Peter was known for his strong and impulsive personality. He spoke before thinking, acted before considering the consequences, and sometimes made decisions that surprised everyone around him. But this impulsiveness also revealed something profound about him. Peter had a courageous heart, full of passion and a deep desire to follow Jesus, even if he stumbled along the way. The scene takes place on a memorable evening at the Sea of Galilee. The sun had already set, and the sky was dark. Peter and the other disciples were in a boat, rowing against the strong winds blowing across the sea. The waves crashed violently against the hull, rocking the boat back and forth. Exhaustion was setting in. They had been rowing for hours, and the sea seemed increasingly hostile. Suddenly, in the midst of the storm, something completely unexpected happened. In the distance, through the shadows of the night and the spray of the waves, they saw a figure approaching. Someone was walking on the water. At first, the disciples were terrified. After all, who could possibly do such a thing? Some even thought it was a ghost. Fear gripped the boat and their hearts. But then, a familiar voice rang out, cutting through the noise of the waves and the howling wind. "Take courage. It is I. Do not be afraid." It was Jesus. Yes, it was him, walking calmly on the turbulent waters as if the raging sea were solid ground beneath his feet. Imagine the impact of that moment. The disciples were stunned, unable to believe what they were witnessing. It was then that Peter, impulsive as ever, did something astonishing. Instead of hiding in the boat or freezing in fear like the others, he gathered his courage and shouted, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water." Who else would have the boldness to say such a thing? Who else but Peter would dare to challenge the waves to get closer to Jesus? Peter didn't think twice. His passion for the Master drove him to take steps that others wouldn't dare. And then, Jesus responded with a simple yet powerful word. "Come." At that moment, Peter did the unthinkable. He stepped out of the boat. The wind howled fiercely, and the waves surged around him, but Peter didn't look back. His feet touched the water, and he didn't sink. He was walking on the sea, on the water, just like Jesus. His heart raced, the disciples watched in awe, and the impossible was happening. But then, something changed. As long as Peter kept his eyes fixed on Jesus, he was able to keep going. Yet, in a moment of distraction, he felt the force of the wind, saw the size of the waves, and allowed fear to creep into his heart. He took his eyes off Jesus and began to sink. The boldness that had propelled him out of the boat now seemed to abandon him. Desperate, Peter cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus, as always, was ready to extend his hand. Immediately, he grabbed Peter and pulled him up from the water, like a father catching a child about to fall. With a steady, loving gaze, Jesus said, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" As the two climbed back into the boat, the wind died down. The sea, which had been wild and furious, became calm and serene like a peaceful lake. The disciples, overwhelmed and filled with reverence, knelt down and worshipped Jesus, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." The sun shone brightly over the hills of Caesarea Philippi. It was a somewhat remote and tranquil region, surrounded by mountains and lush vegetation. Peter and the disciples walked alongside Jesus, as they often did. The Master seemed intent on leading them away from the crowds, as if this day were set aside for something important. The breeze was gentle, and the sound of their footsteps blended with the rustling of the trees around them. As they walked, the conversation seemed deeper than usual. Jesus, who so often taught in parables and performed miracles, now wanted his disciples to reflect on something that would change everything. They didn't know it yet, but they were about to experience one of the most significant moments in their journey with the Master. Jesus stopped walking and looked at the group with that gaze that seemed to pierce straight into their hearts. He asked a simple question, but one filled with meaning. "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" The disciples looked at one another. It was an interesting question. They knew that wherever they went, people talked about Jesus, trying to understand who he really was. Some admired his miracles and words, but many still didn't comprehend what they were witnessing. Then one of them answered, "Some say you are John the Baptist." Another added, "Others say you are Elijah." And another voice chimed in, "Or one of the ancient prophets, like Jeremiah." They were reporting what they had heard from the people. To many, Jesus was a great prophet, someone sent by God, but still, just a man. Then Jesus asked the question that would change everything. He looked deeply at his disciples and asked, "But what about you? Who do you say I am?" In that moment, silence fell over them. The wind seemed to pause, and Jesus' eyes searched each of them. It was as if the question could probe not just their thoughts but the depths of their hearts. Peter, impulsive as always but with a faith that was beginning to grow into something far greater than himself, didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, looked at Jesus with determination, and declared with a voice full of conviction, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Those words echoed among the disciples. Peter had spoken something no one else had dared to say with such certainty. He wasn't just recognizing Jesus as a prophet or a wise teacher, but as the Christ, the promised Messiah, the one Israel had been waiting for over generations. Jesus' face lit up. Peter had said something profound, something revealing, and Jesus knew those words hadn't come from Peter alone. So he replied, "Blessed are you, Simon son of Jonah. For this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven." Imagine Peter's expression in that moment. Jesus was telling him that he, a simple fisherman, had just received a revelation directly from God. It was something far too great to fully understand, but it filled Peter's heart with a joy and sense of purpose he had never felt before. And Jesus continued, speaking words that would forever change Peter's life. "And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it." In that moment, Peter, who had once been just Simon, an ordinary man with his flaws and impulsive nature, was given a new purpose for his life. He would be a rock, a foundation for the church Jesus was establishing. A man who once fished for fish would now be called to fish for souls. The weight and significance of Jesus' words were immeasurable. He saw in Peter not just his flaws or limitations, but his potential. Jesus knew that even with his doubts and mistakes, Peter would become a leader, a man capable of influencing lives and carrying the message of God's kingdom to the world. The other disciples likely looked at Peter with admiration and perhaps even surprise. But Jesus knew what he was doing. He saw far beyond appearances. While Peter saw himself as just a fisherman, Jesus saw a leader. While Peter saw weakness, Jesus saw strength shaped by faith. Peter's declaration was a turning point. From that moment on, the disciples began to understand that Jesus was not just someone sent by God, but the very Son of God. This truth started to take root in their hearts, like a flame being kindled, growing stronger each day. However, Peter didn't yet know what the future held for him. He would still face challenges, failures, and moments of doubt. But on that day, he was the first to affirm, with all his heart and unwavering faith, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And that truth changed everything.